Centuries ago, profound debates about existence and God unfolded in complete silence. Medieval thinkers built entire languages without sound, using hand gestures, architectural forms, and symbolic images to explore the deepest questions of life. By the end of this journey, you will understand how these forgotten silent systems shaped our entire intellectual history, revealing a hidden layer of human thought. We will uncover how monks debated virtue with their hands and how cathedrals were designed as philosophical arguments in stone. What does it mean for a society to build its most important ideas without a single spoken word? In a world where few could read, sound was not the only carrier of meaning. Across the scattered monasteries and emerging universities of medieval Europe, a profound need for order and inner reflection gave rise to sophisticated systems of silent communication. These were not simple gestures for basic needs. They were complete languages born from the daily rhythms of monastic life, where vows of silence were common. Within these quiet communities, monks developed intricate hand signs to discuss everything from the mundane, like requesting a loaf of bread, to the deeply spiritual, such as seeking clarification on a point of scripture. The entire structure of their society, built on ritual and a clear visual hierarchy from king to peasant, made this possible. Every stained glass window, every heraldic symbol on a knight's shield, reinforced a culture that thought in pictures and understood silent signals. This reveals a startling truth. For these communities, silence was not an empty void. It was a rich and fertile space, a different channel for thought entirely. It was within this unique channel that the most abstract ideas about virtue, God, and existence itself began to be conveyed without a single spoken word. These silent lexicons evolved into something far more complex than a simple request for food. Within the cool stone walls of a monastery scriptorium, a monk might catch his brother's eye and form a deliberate gesture with his hands. This was not a request for another parchment. It was a question about the nature of divine grace, or a commentary on a passage from Augustine. Orders like the Benedictines and Cistercians developed hundreds of these signs, creating the world's first philosophical dictionaries written not in ink, but in air. The system was logical and beautifully layered. A sign for an everyday object was often direct. The sign for a book might be the pantomime of opening one and reading. But what about an idea you cannot see? How do you gesture toward virtue or define the abstract concept of a soul? This is where the language transcended mere utility and became a true vehicle for thought. A sign for virtue might involve a hand placed over the heart, followed by a slow, upward motion, suggesting an inner quality rising toward the divine. A sign for sin could be a quick, sharp motion away from the body, indicating a falling away from God's order. Each of these symbolic gestures was a carefully crafted definition, a tiny visual sermon. These signs were not improvised. They were carefully written down in manuals taught to novices and standardized across communities. A monk in France and a monk in England could, in theory, discuss the complexities of scripture or the challenges of moral living using the same silent vocabulary. This was a sophisticated, non-verbal philosophy in action. It proves that profound intellectual exchange does not require sound. It only requires a shared system of meaning, a common visual language through which the most elusive ideas can be given form and substance. But this silent language of philosophy was not confined to the monastery. It spilled out into the very heart of public life, performed on the grandest stage of all, the church. Every movement a priest made during the Mass was a deliberate, silent statement. The most dramatic of these was the elevation of the host. As the priest lifted the consecrated bread high above his head, the entire congregation fell into a profound silence. This was not just a signal for reverence. It was a physical argument, a gesture that enacted the core philosophical doctrine of transubstantiation. Without a single word, that upward motion visually declared that the ordinary substance of bread had transformed. Its inner reality changed into the divine presence of Christ. For a society where most could not read the Latin scriptures, this gesture was the sermon. It made an invisible, metaphysical truth visible and tangible. Even the simplest ritual, like the sign of the cross, was dense with meaning. When a person touched their forehead, chest, and shoulders, they were not just praying. They were physically tracing a compact summary of Christian philosophy onto their own body. The gesture invoked the Trinity, the three-in-one nature of God, while simultaneously mapping the story of Christ's descent from heaven, his death on earth, and his reign over all creation. It was a personal, embodied recitation of a complex creed. Every bow, every genuflection, every procession around a cathedral was part of this vocabulary. These movements taught people about hierarchy, humility, and the soul's journey toward salvation through a language everyone could understand, the language of the human body in motion. This transforms our understanding of these rituals. They were far more than empty tradition or simple devotion. For the medieval mind, to perform the ritual was to think the thought. To move through the liturgy was to walk through a philosophical argument about the nature of reality, God, and humanity's place within it. The entire community, from the most educated theologian to the humblest farmer, participated in this shared, non-verbal dialogue. They were not merely watching a performance. They were internalizing the deepest tenets of their worldview through their own actions, blurring the line between physical practice and profound intellectual engagement. The architecture around them reinforced this silent education, a concept we must now explore. A knight riding into battle presented more than a threat of steel. He was a moving philosophical argument. His shield, emblazoned with a unique arrangement of symbols, was his silent manifesto. This was heraldry, a complex visual language that communicated a knight's entire identity, from his bloodline to his deepest virtues, all framed within the medieval understanding of a divinely ordered universe. A golden lion rampant was not merely a decoration. It was a declaration of courage and noble authority. A soaring eagle symbolized a mind capable of transcending earthly matters to grasp higher truths. Even the colors held profound meaning. Gold spoke of generosity, blue of loyalty, and red of a warrior's fortitude in battle. This was a system where every element was a deliberate choice, a symbol loaded with ethical and metaphysical weight. The arrangement of these symbols was not random artistry. It followed a strict grammar of its own, a set of rules known as the laws of heraldry. This structure mirrored the medieval world's obsession with hierarchy and harmony. The shield was often divided into sections, with the most important symbols, like the lion or the eagle, occupying the most honorable positions. This visual hierarchy was a direct reflection of the great chain of being, the belief that everything in creation, from the lowest stone to God himself, had a fixed and rightful place. A knight's coat of arms was his public claim to a specific rung on that cosmic ladder. It visually argued for his family's right to their land, their title, and their role in society, all sanctioned by divine will. In the chaos of a tournament or on a distant battlefield, this silent language was instantly legible. A rival knight, a foreign diplomat, or a common soldier could look at a shield and understand not just who was approaching, but what they stood for. It communicated complex ideas of lineage, duty, and philosophical commitment across language barriers, all without a single shouted word. This transforms a simple piece of battlefield equipment into a powerful tool of non-verbal philosophy. The shield was a compact, wearable treatise on identity and worldview, proving once again that the medieval mind was a master of encoding its most profound ideas into a silent, visual form. The silent philosophy of the knight's shield found its ultimate expression in the very air people breathed, in the stone that surrounded them. A medieval cathedral was a symphony of frozen thought. When you stand beneath its towering vaults, you are not just in a building. You are inside a three-dimensional argument about the nature of reality. The entire structure was a carefully engineered experience designed to guide the soul. The long central aisle, the nave, was not merely a path for processions. It was shaped like a ship, a visual declaration that the church was the vessel that would carry humanity through the turbulent seas of life to the safe harbor of salvation. This was not a subtle metaphor. It was an architectural fact you walked through with your own body. Your physical journey down the nave was a silent lesson in your spiritual journey. Above, the great rose window at the west end glowed like a cosmic diagram. Its intricate stone tracery and brilliantly colored glass were not random decorations. They were a map of the universe as medieval philosophers understood it, radiating out from a central point, symbolizing God as the unmoved mover, the source of all order and light. Every element in that complex pattern had a place, teaching the viewer about a world governed by divine harmony and hierarchy. Even the grotesque gargoyles peering down from the rain spouts had a philosophical job. They represented the chaotic forces of evil and disorder, but they were always depicted as being safely outside the sacred space or trapped in the act of carrying water away from the holy walls. They visually argued that faith and the church's structure could keep malevolence at bay, but the most powerful statement was the building's upward thrust. Those impossibly high ceilings and needle-like spires were a direct application of Neoplatonic thought, a philosophy that prized the ascent from the heavy, imperfect material world toward the luminous, perfect realm of the divine. The architecture did not just suggest this idea, it physically enacted it. Your eyes, and with them your mind, were pulled irresistibly upward from the solid ground of the earthly nave, past the glowing windows telling sacred stories, toward the dizzying heights of the ceiling, which seemed to dissolve into light. This was a silent sermon on the soul's potential for transcendence. An illiterate farmer, a wealthy merchant, and a university scholar could all enter this space and read the same profound truths. They learned about cosmology from the windows, theology from the sculpted biblical scenes, and their own purpose from the very path they walked. The cathedral was the ultimate silent book, its pages made of stone and light, waiting for anyone to step inside and begin reading. The most complex philosophical libraries of the Middle Ages had no physical books at all. They existed entirely within the mind. Medieval scholars, grappling with a flood of theological and philosophical knowledge, developed a stunningly effective technique known as the art of memory. This was far more than a simple trick for remembering facts. It was a profound philosophical practice that treated the human mind as a structured universe, a sacred space where abstract truths could be given form and visited at will. The method was both simple and brilliantly complex. A scholar would first construct a detailed building in their imagination, a memory palace. This could be a real place, like the cathedral they walked through every day, or a purely imagined mansion with countless rooms, halls, and niches. The architecture of the mind mirrored the architecture of the cosmos, an ordered hierarchy where everything had its proper place. Once this mental structure was solid, the real work began. To remember a complex philosophical argument about ethics, the scholar would not repeat the words. Instead, they would create a vivid, often bizarre, symbolic image and place it in a specific location within their palace. To recall the nuances of divine justice, they might visualize a detailed statue of Lady Justice, but not just any statue. Her scales might be tipped with a specific gem to represent mercy, and her blindfold woven from a particular fabric to signify impartiality. The more striking and unusual the image, the more firmly it would lodge in the memory. When the scholar needed to retrieve the argument, they would simply take a mental walk through their palace. Entering the third courtyard, they would see the statue of justice, and the entire intricate web of reasoning about law, virtue, and divine order would unfold from that single, silent symbol. This system transformed the act of thinking itself. Philosophy became a spatial and visual endeavor. Abstract concepts like charity, logic, or the nature of the soul were no longer floating ideas. They were tangible residents in a mental landscape, each one a key that unlocked vast stores of knowledge. This reveals a fundamental belief of the era, that truth was not just something to be understood, but something to be mapped and navigated. The mind itself became the ultimate silent sign system, a private cathedral of thought where the most profound ideas were stored not as sounds or written words, but as powerful, resonant images. This internal practice mirrors the external world of heraldry and ritual. Just as a knight's shield used a lion to symbolize courage, the scholar used a mental lion to represent a specific philosophical text. Both systems relied on a shared grammar of symbols to compress and convey complex information. The real question this raises is how these different silent languages, from the monk's hands to the scholar's imagination, began to influence each other, creating a unified culture of non-verbal thought that would shape the centuries to come. A choir book, open on a wooden stand, held more than melodies. Its pages contained a silent geometry, a map of the universe written in ink. The earliest musical notations, the curved marks called neumes, were simple gestures above the text, reminding a singer of a melody's rise and fall. But this system evolved into something far more profound. With the introduction of the staff, those 4 lines drawn across the parchment, music became a precise visual language of mathematical relationships. The exact vertical placement of a note was not arbitrary. It was a philosophical statement. A note placed on one line and a note placed on the next represented a specific interval, a mathematical ratio of sound. This was the direct application of a philosophy stretching back to Pythagoras, refined by thinkers like Boethius, which held that number and proportion were the hidden architecture of everything. They believed the same mathematical ratios that made a musical chord sound beautiful also governed the motion of the planets and the very structure of the human soul. To sing from this book, then, was not merely to perform a religious duty. It was to participate in a cosmic order. The singer's voice was physically enacting these perfect proportions, aligning their own inner being with the harmony of the spheres. The act of reading the music became a form of non-verbal intellectual work. A monk tracing the notes with his finger was silently comprehending a diagram of divine principles. He was seeing order made visible, beauty translated into spatial relationships on a page. The choir book was a bridge. It took the abstract, intelligible reality of number, a concept you could only think about, and gave it a sensible form you could see and hear. This reveals the ultimate ambition of these medieval sign systems. They were not just tools for communication. They were attempts to build ladders from the world of the senses to the world of the mind, from the messy reality of human experience to the perfect, silent harmony of the divine. Every gesture, every symbol, every note was a rung on that ladder. Even the most sacred texts held a secret, silent rebellion in their margins. while the central script on a manuscript page presented the official, authorized philosophy, the borders teemed with a chaotic carnival of visual commentary. Here, in the space known as Marginalia, artists painted a bizarre and wonderful world of drolleries, grotesques, and symbolic beasts. A rabbit, typically the prey, might be depicted drawing a bow and hunting the hunter. This was not random silliness. It was a profound visual critique, a silent argument about the inversion of the natural order or the folly of human pride. A hybrid creature, part human and part beast, could physically embody a complex theological paradox, making a difficult concept about divine and human nature instantly graspable. These images were a parallel discourse, a second layer of philosophy running alongside the main text. They questioned, they elaborated, and sometimes they subtly subverted the very words they accompanied. This created a multi-layered conversation happening entirely in the silent space of the page. A monk reading the text would then glance at the margin and be prompted to think more deeply, to see the idea from a different, often more playful angle. The truth of the manuscript was no longer just in the words. It was in the dynamic relationship between the written doctrine and the painted sign. This practice invited the reader into an active role, forcing a multimodal interpretation where sight and intellect worked together to construct meaning. The silent, vibrant world in the margins proves that medieval thinkers understood a powerful concept we often associate with modern times, that no single perspective holds a monopoly on truth, and that even the most serious ideas can be illuminated by a touch of the absurd. For the mystic, ordinary words were a cage. When Hildegard of Bingen experienced her blazing visions, she described a living brightness that utterly defied the vocabulary of her day. How could she possibly explain the feeling of the universe pouring through her soul? Language, built for the earthly and the tangible, shattered against the ineffable. Her solution was to build a new language from scratch, one composed not of words, but of images and sensations. She painstakingly dictated and illustrated her revelations, creating intricate mandala-like diagrams that are still mesmerizing today. One of her most famous images shows a human figure at the very center of a series of concentric circles, which represent the layers of the cosmos. This was not a random drawing. It was a precise philosophical argument in visual form, a sign system mapping the soul's position within a divinely ordered creation. Every ring, every flame-like burst, every symbolic creature was a piece of a complex vocabulary. The image conveyed what sermons could not, blending theology, cosmology, and the personal journey of the spirit into a single, silent statement. Her work demonstrates that the most profound philosophical acts often happen when language fails. For Hildegard and for mystics like Meister Eckhart, who spoke of a God beyond all names, creating these symbolic systems was the only way to think about the unthinkable. It was an attempt to give a visible form to the utterly formless. This pushes the very definition of philosophy. We often see it as a discipline of rigorous debate and dense texts, but here it becomes something else entirely, a deeply personal, visual, and sensory endeavor. The mystic's vision is a kind of non-verbal reasoning, a direct grappling with ultimate reality that bypasses the clumsy medium of speech and lands instead in a realm of pure symbol. This reveals the ultimate limit of the sound-based languages we have explored and points toward a truth that resonates even today. Some of our most important ideas about existence begin not with a word, but with a silent, overwhelming vision that demands its own unique form of expression. A clod of earth was more than dirt, it was a kingdom. When a lord knelt and handed a piece of turf to a kneeling vassal, this simple, silent act transferred vast estates and the power over everyone who lived on them. In a world where few could read a written charter, the physical substance of the land itself became the contract. The vassal's hands closing around the soil was a non-verbal agreement, a bond of loyalty and service made terrifyingly concrete. This gesture embodied a deep philosophical principle, the intrinsic connection between a person and the property they held, a bond so fundamental it could be represented by the very earth beneath their feet. The legal system was built on this visual grammar. The most solemn promises were not just spoken, they were performed with sacred objects. A person swearing an oath would place their hand on a chest containing the bones of a saint. This was not merely for emphasis, it was a silent, physical act that was believed to create a metaphysical chain, binding the swearer's soul to the truth before God himself. To break such an oath was not just a social offense, it was a spiritual catastrophe, a tearing of a bond that reached into the divine realm. These legal signs were what scholars call performative. They did not just describe a reality, they created it. The act of handing over the turf did not symbolize the transfer of land, it was the transfer. The act of touching the relics did not symbolize a promise, it enacted the promise, making it real and binding in the eyes of both society and heaven. This reveals the immense power medieval society granted to its silent sign systems. A gesture could alter the course of a life as surely as a signed document can today. It made abstract principles of law, justice, and obligation immediately present, transforming them from ideas you debated into actions you performed with your own body. In the courtroom, a person's entire testimony could hinge on their demeanor, their posture, the silent language of their physical presence before the judge. This was a world where truth was not only heard but seen and felt, a world where reality itself could be enacted through a shared, understood vocabulary of symbolic action. Your own face was a page in a philosophical manuscript. Medieval doctors and scholars believed the human body was not just a biological machine, but a living, breathing sign system, a direct reflection of the soul's inner state and the universe's grand design. This was not mere superstition. It was a sophisticated framework where medicine, philosophy, and theology converged, reading the silent language of the flesh to understand everything from a person's health to their deepest moral character. At the heart of this system was humoral theory. The body was seen as a delicate balance of four key fluids or humors. Blood made you sanguine, cheerful, and passionate. Phlegm led to a phlegmatic temperament, calm and unemotional. Yellow bile created the choleric person, ambitious and easily angered. And black bile produced the melancholic individual, thoughtful and prone to sadness. A fever was not just a symptom, it was a visible, tangible sign of an excess of yellow bile, a literal inner fire burning out of control. A pale, sluggish complexion was a clear signal of too much phlegm, a cold and damp internal state. The body was constantly speaking this silent language of elemental balance, and the physician's job was to interpret its signs, but this went far beyond physical health. Your dominant humor was believed to shape your entire personality, your very philosophy of life. A melancholic person was seen as naturally inclined toward deep thought and artistic creation, their inner reality of black bile aligning them with the cold, dry element of earth. A sanguine person, full of warm, moist blood, was considered sociable and well-suited to leadership. In this worldview, your temperament was not just a psychological quirk. It was your body's silent argument for your place in the natural order, a physical manifestation of your soul's disposition. This belief extended to the most minute details of a person's appearance through the practice of physiognomy. The art of reading character from faces was treated with the seriousness of a science. A high forehead signified intelligence and a noble mind. Close-set eyes might reveal a suspicious or greedy nature. The curve of a lip, the shape of a nose, the line of a jaw, all of these features were considered outward signs of an invisible inner truth. The body was a text, and every feature was a word in a silent discourse on the relationship between the physical and the spiritual. This created a world where the boundary between the inner self and the outer shell completely dissolved. You were your body, and your body was a philosophy. It was a microcosm, a tiny model of the macrocosm, the great universe itself. The same four elements that composed the world, earth, air, fire, and water, were the building blocks of your own flesh and the humors that flowed within it. An imbalance in the cosmos, like a terrible storm, could find its parallel in an imbalance within a person, causing a fever or a fit of rage. This somatic semiotics meant that to understand a human being was to learn to read them, to decipher the silent, physical sermon they were constantly preaching through their very existence. It raises a haunting question about our own time. How much of our own first impressions, our instant judgments of character based on a face or a posture, are distant echoes of this medieval belief that the body is a legible text, silently announcing the secrets of the soul? A bubbling alembic held more than molten metal. It contained the entire cosmos in miniature. Alchemy was not a primitive attempt at chemistry, but a profound philosophical system, and its language was a silent lexicon of symbols. The Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, was not merely a picture. It was a complete thesis on the cyclical nature of existence, the unity of beginnings and endings, and the eternal process of death and rebirth necessary for all transformation. This single, looping image conveyed a concept that would require pages of dense prose to explain. The green lion devouring the sun was another startling symbol. It represented the initial, chaotic stage of the great work, where raw primal matter, symbolized by the lion, had to confront and absorb the refining power of spirit, symbolized by the sun. This was a silent, dramatic argument about the necessary struggle between opposing forces to achieve a higher synthesis. Even the simple philosophical egg, the sealed vessel where the transformation occurred, was a potent sign. It stood for the contained soul, the protected mind, or the entire universe before its differentiation into the myriad forms we see. Each symbol was a compact philosophical engine, designed to trigger deep contemplation rather than simple recognition. Astrology operated on the same principle. Its glyphs were a silent shorthand for vast philosophical concepts. The circle with a dot at its center, the symbol for the sun, was not just a label for a star. It represented the core self, the vital spirit, and the principle of conscious identity in the universe. The crescent-shaped symbol for the moon stood for the subconscious, the rhythms of nature, and the receptive mind. When an astrologer drew these symbols on a chart, they were not predicting trivial events. They were mapping a philosophical landscape of fate and free will, visually arguing that the macrocosm of the heavens and the microcosm of the human soul were intimately connected by invisible threads of influence and correspondence. This visual language was perfectly suited to its purpose. Linear prose, with its step-by-step logic, could describe a process, but it struggled to capture the simultaneous, interlocking nature of cosmic principles. A single alchemical illustration, crowded with symbolic animals, celestial bodies, and geometric forms, could present an entire theory of spiritual ascent in one holistic glance. It allowed the practitioner to hold the whole system in their mind at once, to see the relationships between the base and the sublime, the material and the spiritual. To work with these symbols was to think in a different way, to reason through visual analogy and metaphorical resonance. It was a silent dialogue with the deepest patterns of reality, a way of doing philosophy with images instead of words. This reveals that the medieval quest for knowledge was not a single path. It was a symphony of different modes of thought, where the silent, symbolic reasoning of the alchemist complemented the logical disputation of the university scholar. Both were seeking the same ultimate truths, but one chose to build its arguments in the language of pictures, a language that could express the inexpressible complexities of a living, transforming universe. A dropped glove was not a simple accident. It was a declaration, a question, and a test of virtue, all wrapped into one silent moment. In the courts of love, romance was a high-stakes philosophical game, and its language was spoken entirely through gestures, objects, and colors. A knight retrieving a lady's fallen glove was not performing a mere courtesy. He was engaging in a complex ritual. The way he returned it, with a bowed head and the glove presented on his outstretched palms, articulated a profound respect for her as an almost divine figure, a lady whose favor would morally refine him. The entire interaction, from the deliberate drop to the reverent return, was a non-verbal dialogue about the nature of desire and the pursuit of ethical perfection. This elaborate code transformed every social gathering into a silent seminar on the philosophy of love. The colors a lady wore sent unmistakable signals. A gown of deep green might signify a growing affection, while one of bright yellow could indicate jealousy or rejection. A knight's attire was equally legible. He might wear his lady's token, a scarf or a sleeve, tied to his armor in a tournament, visually arguing that his courage and strength were dedicated to her, that her influence was the source of his valor. Even the subtlest movements were parsed for meaning. The specific angle of a bow, the duration of a glance, the acceptance or refusal of a shared cup, each was a weighted word in this silent vocabulary. This was not a secret language for illicit affairs. It was a public performance of a social philosophy that saw romantic love as a civilizing force. The goal was not mere possession, but the ennoblement of the lover. By submitting to this intricate code of conduct and striving to win the approval of a lady who embodied virtue, a man was supposed to cultivate his own patience, bravery, and moral discernment. Love became a path to self-improvement, a journey mapped out not in books, but in a continuous, silent ballet of meaningful actions. Every gesture, from the offering of a flower to the way a hand was kissed, reinforced a shared understanding of the relationship between emotion, ethics, and social standing. The court became a stage where the deepest questions of the human heart were explored not through sonnets or speeches, but through a living, breathing system of signs. A student in a medieval lecture hall was not just reading a book, they were climbing a tree. The Porphyrian tree was one of the most powerful educational tools of the age, a sprawling diagram that mapped the entire structure of reality from the most general category at its roots to the most specific individual at its branches. At the very top, you might find the broadest concept, substance. The trunk would then split into two main branches, corporeal and incorporeal. From corporeal, smaller branches sprouted like living and non-living. From living, further divisions led to sensate and insensate, and so on, all the way down to a single leaf representing Socrates, a specific man. This was not a simple chart for memorization. It was a complete lesson in Aristotelian logic and metaphysics, rendered entirely in visual form. To trace its pathways with a finger was to physically follow the process of logical division, to understand how the mind categorizes the world through a silent, spatial argument. The tree's very structure taught the hierarchical nature of creation, reinforcing the great chain of being through its own elegant, branching design. Another common schema, the ladder of virtues, presented ethics as a vertical journey. Each rung represented a virtue to be mastered, starting with the most basic, like humility, and ascending step by step toward the highest, like divine love. A student did not just read a description of charity. They saw it placed above patience on the ladder, understanding its greater spiritual value through its elevated position. This transformed abstract moral philosophy into a tangible, visual ascent. The mind was trained to see progression, dependency, and hierarchy. Learning became an act of visual navigation. These diagrams were philosophical engines. Their spatial arrangement, the verticality of the ladder, the radiating branches of the tree, did the intellectual work that paragraphs of text might struggle to achieve. They compressed complex relationships into a single, comprehensible image, allowing a scholar to grasp an entire system of thought in one sustained glance. This pedagogical method reveals a profound medieval conviction that the human mind could apprehend truth more directly through a well-ordered image than through a linear sequence of words. The eye could see logical relationships that the ear might only hear sequentially. This was a form of silent, visual reasoning that shaped generations of thinkers, training them to find order and connection in a seemingly chaotic world. It makes you wonder about our own modern tools, our flowcharts and mind maps. Are we, in our digital age, rediscovering this ancient truth that some of our most powerful thinking happens not in sentences, but in spaces and shapes? A dusty road stretching toward a distant cathedral was a sentence in a story written across the landscape. The medieval pilgrimage was a sprawling, silent narrative, and the pilgrim walking that path was both its reader and its main character. Each milestone was a word, each shrine a chapter, and each relic a climax in a philosophical argument performed with the body. The journey itself was the first layer of meaning. Leaving home and comfort behind to undertake a difficult, often dangerous trek was a non-verbal declaration that the spiritual quest required physical sacrifice. The blistered feet, the hunger, the exposure to the elements, these were not unfortunate side effects. They were an essential part of the discourse, a silent meditation on the soul's own struggle through a fallen world toward grace. The pilgrim did not just hear sermons about humility and perseverance, they enacted them with every weary step. Arriving at a shrine was not the end of the story, but a deepening of its theme. Here, the language of signs became intensely focused. A relic, perhaps a sliver of bone said to be from a saint, was the central symbol. To modern eyes, this can seem like simple superstition, but for the medieval pilgrim, it was something far more profound. This was a tactile philosophy. The relic was a sign that collapsed distance, both physical and metaphysical. It made the holy immediately present. This was not magic. It was a deeply held belief in the communion of saints, the idea that all believers, living and dead, were connected in a single mystical body. The saint was not gone, their virtue was not a forgotten tale. Their enduring presence was focused in this physical fragment, this anchor point between heaven and earth. Venerating the relic, touching it with a trembling hand or pressing a prayer against its container, was a physical engagement with that transcendent reality. It was a silent conversation with the saint, a plea for intercession, and a tangible connection to the divine grace that the saint now fully embodied. The entire pilgrimage, from the first step to the final, tearful prayer before the relic, was a unified sign system. It taught that truth was not just something to be understood intellectually, but something to be walked toward, suffered for, and physically encountered. The road, the shrine, and the sacred object together formed a complete, non-verbal discourse on the human condition, arguing that our relation to the divine is not a matter of abstract belief, but a journey that requires our whole being, body, and soul to complete. A king kneeling to receive his crown was performing his first act of rule. The coronation ceremony was a masterwork of non-verbal rhetoric, a carefully staged drama where every prop and movement was a loaded statement about the nature of power itself. The crown placed upon his head was not merely a piece of jewelry. Its immense weight was a physical lesson, a constant, pressing reminder that sovereignty was a burden, a solemn duty rather than a personal privilege. The scepter placed in his right hand was not a simple rod. It was a visible argument for his role as the source of law and justice, an extension of his arm that would theoretically strike down evil and uphold the good. But the most profound moment was often the most subtle, the anointing with holy oil. This was the silent core of the entire political philosophy. The oil, consecrated for this single purpose, was believed to mark a metaphysical change. It signified that the king was no longer just a mortal man. He was now the Lord's anointed, God's own lieutenant on earth. This act visually established the doctrine of divine right, arguing that his authority flowed not from the consent of the nobility or the people, but directly from heaven. This ceremonial language brilliantly articulated a complex legal and political theory known as the king's two bodies. The king possessed both a body natural, which was his own mortal, physical self, subject to illness and error, and a body politic, which was the eternal, undying office of the monarchy itself. The coronation ritual made this abstract idea stunningly visible. When the king was anointed and crowned, the ceremony was focused on transforming his mortal body into the vessel for this immortal political body. The crown did not belong to the man, it belonged to the office. This is why the cry following a king's death was, "The king is dead, long live the king." The mortal body had perished, but the political body was instantly transferred to his successor. The entire ritual was designed to make this transfer of an eternal office legible to everyone present, from the highest duke to the lowest commoner. It was a silent lesson in the continuity of the state, teaching that the realm itself was a perpetual entity, embodied for a time in a single, fallible man. The spatial arrangement of the ceremony reinforced this philosophy of hierarchy. The king sat enthroned high above everyone else, a living diagram of the great chain of being. His elevated position was a constant, visual reminder of his unique place in the social and cosmic order. The precise sequence in which he received the symbols of power, who placed them in his hands, and the order of the oath sworn, all formed a grammatical structure. This structure communicated the intricate relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. In some kingdoms, a bishop would crown the king, visually suggesting that the church held a role in legitimizing secular power. In the papal inauguration, the new pope was carried on a special chair, the sedia gestatoria, elevating him literally and symbolically above the crowd, a silent declaration of his supreme spiritual office. There were no political speeches, no debates over policy. The entire ideology of governance, the very justification for why one man should rule over others, was conveyed through a symphony of silent signs. A scepter, a vial of oil, a heavy crown, these were the words of a political treatise written not on parchment, but in the air of the cathedral, understood by all who witnessed its powerful, wordless performance. This profound cultivation of silence was not a passive emptiness, but an active and demanding philosophical discipline. For orders like the Carthusians, who embraced a life of near total silence, the absence of speech was a carefully constructed tool. It was a method for clearing away the mental noise of everyday chatter, the endless internal monologue, and the distortions inherent in language itself. Their practice was rooted in a tradition known as the via negativa, or the negative way. This was not a path of despair, but a radical approach to truth. It argued that human words and concepts were simply too small, too tied to our limited sensory experience, to ever adequately describe the infinite nature of God or ultimate reality. Any positive statement, like "God is good," was ultimately inadequate because our human understanding of goodness is a faint shadow of the divine reality. So instead of trying to define the undefinable with more and more words, the mystic took the opposite path. They systematically stripped away all descriptions. They moved beyond saying what God is and instead focused on what God is not. God is not finite, not changeable, not limited by human categories. By silently letting go of each imperfect concept, they sought to create a space of pure receptivity within the soul, a void where a truer, wordless understanding could dawn. In this philosophy, silence becomes the most eloquent language of all. It is the respectful acknowledgement that some truths are too vast for sentences. The act of not speaking, then, was not a lack of engagement. It was the deepest form of engagement possible, a conscious choice to listen for a voice that speaks in the quiet between thoughts. This challenges our most basic modern assumption that thinking is synonymous with internal speech. The Carthusian monk sitting in his cell for hours was not doing nothing. He was practicing a form of wordless attention, a rigorous mental and spiritual exercise aimed at perceiving a reality that language could only point toward but never fully contain. His entire life was an argument that the highest wisdom begins where words end. A Latin knight and an Arab emir could share no common tongue, but they understood the language of a gift. In the bustling marketplaces of Toledo or the tense diplomatic meetings of Outremer, spoken words were often useless, filtered through unreliable translators and clouded by mutual suspicion. In this space, a different kind of conversation took place, one built on a shared grammar of objects and actions. A finely wrought sword offered hilt first was not merely a valuable present. It was a silent treatise on the shared martial values of both cultures, an acknowledgement of the other's honor and strength, and a non-verbal argument for potential alliance. A shared meal, with its strict rituals of hospitality, became a philosophical statement about common humanity, transcending religious differences through the universal acts of eating and drinking. These interactions created a borderland semiotics, a pidgin language of signs that was essential for survival and coexistence. The artistic motifs that adorned buildings in these contact zones tell a similar story of silent fusion. A Christian church built in a recently conquered Sicilian town might feature arches and geometric patterns borrowed directly from Islamic architecture. This was not mere aesthetic plagiarism. It was a complex visual argument. For the Muslim craftsman, the intricate, non-representational patterns spoke of the infinite, unrepresentable nature of God. For the Christian patron, those same patterns could be read as a representation of the perfect mathematical order of God's creation. The same silent form conveyed two different philosophical concepts, yet it created a shared space of beauty and order that both cultures could inhabit. This hybrid visual language became a crucible for intellectual exchange. A Byzantine mosaicist and a Western theologian, unable to debate the finer points of the Trinity in words, might instead collaborate on a new depiction of Christ Pantocrator. The resulting image, blending Greek subtlety with Latin intensity, became a new visual synthesis, a silent compromise that conveyed a complex theological idea in a single, powerful glance. These reduced, essential forms of communication stripped away the divisive specifics of doctrine to focus on more fundamental, shared human concerns: power, honor, the divine, and the desire for order. On the frontiers of the medieval world, philosophy was not always debated in university halls. Often, it was silently negotiated with a gifted sword, shared in a ceremonial cup, or carved into the stone of a shared holy space, proving that when words fail, signs can build bridges. A dying person's final breath was the last line of a lifelong philosophical manuscript. In the late Middle Ages, a new genre of literature, the ars moriendi, or art of dying, became a bestseller. It provided a complete script for one's final hours, a set of visual and gestural cues that transformed the deathbed into a stage for the soul's ultimate performance. This was not a morbid fascination with the end, but a profound belief that how a person died was the ultimate expression of their entire life's philosophy. The manuals were filled with detailed illustrations, not of skeletons, but of the dying person surrounded by angels and demons, each group silently acting out a spiritual battle. The real drama, however, was in the physical responses of the person in the bed. Their actions became the most important signs of their inner state. To clutch a crucifix with both hands was not just a pious gesture. It was a non-verbal declaration of faith, a physical anchoring of the soul to the story of Christ's redemption. When a dying person turned their face away from a tempting vision of worldly wealth offered by a demonic figure, that simple turn of the head was a powerful performance of renunciation and hope for a higher reward. Even the act of raising a hand to offer a final, weak blessing to a grieving family member was a sign of charity and acceptance, a final communication of love and theological assurance. Every posture, every glance, every feeble gesture was read by those gathered around the bed as a direct indicator of the soul's preparedness for eternity. A peaceful expression was a sign of hope in salvation. A final, whispered prayer was a sign of unwavering faith. This ritualized dying was the ultimate use of the body as a philosophical instrument. In those last moments, the person was not just leaving the world, they were delivering a silent sermon to the community, using the only language left to them, the language of their own failing flesh. Their death became a final, powerful argument about the meaning of the life they had lived, a non-verbal testament to their deepest convictions about God, virtue, and the nature of the soul's journey into the infinite. Yet this rich world of silent signs was not without its powerful detractors. A radical philosophical movement known as Nominalism began to question the very foundations of this entire system. Thinkers like William of Ockham argued that our words and signs are merely names we invent for convenience. They are labels, not perfect mirrors of reality. A sign for virtue, no matter how beautifully gestured, does not contain the actual essence of virtue itself. It is just a human convention, a pointer that can easily mislead. This was a direct challenge to the mainstream medieval view that symbols participated in the divine realities they represented. The Nominalists warned that signs could become idols. A stunning stained glass window depicting God could, over time, become the object of worship instead of the invisible, transcendent reality it was meant to point toward. The very tools built to elevate the mind could end up trapping it, confusing the beautifully crafted map for the mysterious, unmappable territory of divine truth. This internal critique reveals a stunning level of self-awareness within medieval thought. These philosophers understood the constant risk of what they called idolatry of the concept, where the human mind falls in love with its own creations, its own systems of signs, and forgets that they are only fragile bridges to a truth that lies forever beyond them. This dilemma echoes in our own time. Every model we build, every language we speak, every diagram we draw to explain the universe shares this same inherent limitation. The map is never the territory. The menu is not the meal. The medieval struggle with the limits of their silent languages was a profound prelude to a problem that still haunts our search for understanding today, reminding us that all our communicative tools, however brilliant, are ultimately fingers pointing at the moon, and we must be careful not to mistake the finger for the moon itself. A single illuminated manuscript required the labor of countless hands and years of painstaking work. In the quiet of the scriptorium, a master scribe would carefully copy not just the text, but every symbolic illustration in the margins, every precise hue of a painted initial. This was not mechanical reproduction. As his quill traced the image of a golden lion, he was also transmitting a specific interpretation of its meaning, perhaps emphasizing its connection to resurrection or royal justice based on his own monastery's teachings. The survival of these visual ideas depended entirely on this chain of meticulous copying, where each generation of monks became a living library of silent philosophy, passing the torch of meaning through their hands as much as through their eyes. Beyond the page, the teaching was deeply personal. A senior monk would take a novice into the cloister and, with deliberate gestures, demonstrate the correct form for the sign representing divine grace, correcting the angle of the wrist or the speed of the motion. This was an oral tradition, but without the mouth. It was a manual tradition, a physical inheritance of knowledge where the body itself learned to think in symbols. In the world outside the monastery, the same process unfolded. A master herald did not simply give an apprentice a book of coats of arms. He taught the grammar of the shield, explaining why a boar symbolized courage in one context and gluttony in another, and how the arrangement of colors spoke of ancient alliances. An architect mentoring a young builder would walk him through a half-built cathedral, pointing out how the curve of an arch was not just an engineering solution, but a visual argument for the vault of heaven. In every case, the master was teaching a way of seeing, a method for decoding the world. This ensured the language remained alive, not a dead code. The meaning of symbols evolved because the culture did. Consider the humble pelican. In early bestiaries, it was a curious creature, but through theological interpretation, it transformed into one of the most potent symbols of Christ's sacrifice. The belief that a pelican would pierce its own breast to feed its dying young with its blood became a widespread allegory for the Eucharist. The image of the pelican in her piety began to appear everywhere, from stone carvings to gold chalices, its meaning enriched and solidified through this very process of teaching and retelling. This adaptability proves these silent systems were not rigid fossils. They were a dynamic, responsive form of thought, constantly being refined and renegotiated by each new generation of thinkers who learned the old signs and then sometimes gave them new life. The silent languages of the Middle Ages did not simply fade away with the arrival of the Renaissance. Their deep-seated habits of thought flowed directly into the intellectual currents of the early modern world, resurfacing in new and powerful forms. Consider the Emblem book, a publishing sensation of the 16th and 17th centuries. Each page presented a triad, a picture, a short motto, and an explanatory poem. This was not a new invention. It was the complete medieval system of visual philosophy repackaged for a literate public. The image, like a coat of arms or a stained glass scene, presented a symbolic puzzle. The motto acted as a heraldic slogan focusing the mind, and the verse unpacked the moral or philosophical meaning, just as a monk might have explained the significance of a ritual gesture. An emblem showing a heart chained to an anchor did not just represent hope. It visually argued for the soul's need for a stable foundation in a tumultuous world, a direct continuation of the medieval impulse to encode complex ethics into a single, legible sign. This was not a departure from the past. It was the popularization of a medieval way of thinking. At the same time, in the emerging world of science, a different kind of sign system was taking root. The medieval desire for a clear, universal language for abstract reasoning found its ultimate expression in the development of formal logic and scientific notation. The intricate symbols of algebra, the precise diagrams of geometry, and the structured arguments of syllogisms all owe a profound debt to that earlier quest. Medieval logicians working in silent scriptoria had painstakingly developed systems to represent logical relationships without the ambiguity of everyday speech. They were building a grammar for pure thought, when early modern scientists like Leibniz dreamed of a universal characteristic, a perfect language of symbols that could eliminate misunderstanding. They were walking a path first cleared by those medieval minds. The equal sign, a simple pair of parallel lines, is a perfect example. It is a silent, universal gesture that conveys a profound philosophical concept of balance and equivalence, a concept medieval philosophers debated at great length. This continuity reveals a stunning truth. The medieval exploration of non-verbal philosophy was not a quaint dead end, but a crucial foundation. It trained the European mind to think in diagrams, to trust symbols, and to see the world as a system of relationships that could be mapped. The bridge from the medieval cathedral to the modern laboratory was built not with stones but with signs. Hildegard of Bingen's divine visions demanded a language Earth did not possess. Her response was to invent one. She called it the lingua ignota, the unknown language, a complete vocabulary of over 1,000 words with its own unique 23-letter alphabet. While scholars still debate whether her nuns ever used it for secret communication, its true purpose was far more radical. Hildegard described this language as being given to her from heaven, a system of signs forged to express realities for which human speech was simply too coarse an instrument. This was not a code for hiding messages. It was a philosophical tool for revealing truth. She was attempting to build what many medieval thinkers only dreamed of, a perfect Adamic language. This would be a vocabulary unsullied by the fall of Babel, where every word directly mirrored the essential nature of the thing it described, where the sign and its divine meaning were perfectly fused. In her glossary, she provided the lingua ignota terms for profound concepts, for angels and virtues, for body parts and plants. The word for God was agons. The word for human was jur. Each term was a deliberate act of creation, an attempt to find a sonic and visual form that could hold a heavenly concept without breaking. Her project represents the ultimate ambition of the medieval silent sign systems we have explored. It was not enough for her to use existing gestures or symbols. When the available tools proved inadequate, she engineered a new one from the ground up, constructing a complete linguistic universe to house her revelations. This endeavor reveals a breathtaking confidence in the power of human invention, when guided by divine inspiration, to bridge the chasm between the human and the divine. Hildegard's lonely, glorious failure to create a perfect language stands as a testament to the enduring medieval conviction that if our words are too small for God, then we must find bigger ones, or better yet, invent them. A medieval monk would have been baffled by the idea of an arbitrary sign. For him, the golden lion on a knight's shield did not just point to the idea of courage. It participated in the very essence of courage, embodying and channeling that divine virtue into the world. This pre-modern understanding of meaning stands in stark contrast to the foundations of modern semiotics, the formal study of signs. In the early 20th century, Ferdinand de Saussure proposed that the connection between a signifier, like a spoken word or a written symbol, and the thing it signifies is entirely arbitrary. There is no natural reason why the letters CAT should mean a small, furry animal. The relationship is based purely on social convention and difference, on the fact that cat is not bat or hat. For the medieval mind, this would have seemed a hollow, even broken system. Their world was built on a fundamentally different principle, where signs were not arbitrary labels but living connections. A relic was not a conventional symbol for a saint. It was a physical conduit for the saint's ongoing spiritual presence and power. The sign did not just represent, it made present. This is what scholars call a participatory semiotics. Meaning was not locked away in a separate realm of ideas, but was woven into the very fabric of the material world, waiting to be read by those who knew how to look. Think of the humoral theory, where a flushed face was not arbitrarily assigned to represent anger. It was understood as a direct physical symptom of an excess of hot, fiery yellow bile burning within the body. The sign and the inner reality were part of a single, continuous system. This holistic view extended to the very structure of the cosmos, where the microcosm of the human body reflected the macrocosm of the universe, each part silently speaking to the other through a language of correspondences. Yet, for all their differences, medieval practitioners and modern theorists were grappling with the same fundamental puzzle: how do signs create meaning? The American philosopher Charles Peirce developed a more complex model than Saussure, categorizing signs as icons, which resemble their object like a portrait, indices, which are physically connected to their object like smoke to fire, and symbols, which are arbitrary like a word. Medieval systems were masterful at employing all three. A painted rose in a manuscript was an icon of the Virgin Mary, resembling her beauty. A fever was an index of an internal imbalance directly caused by it. And a heraldic symbol, while deeply meaningful, also functioned as a symbol, its specific association with a family upheld by social agreement. The crucial distinction lies in the medieval belief that even these conventional symbols were not truly arbitrary. They were seen as part of a divine grammar, a language whose rules were authored by God, not by man. This comparison does not reveal a primitive lack of theory, but a different set of philosophical priorities. Modern semiotics often seeks to analyze and dissect how meaning is constructed. Medieval practice sought to use signs as a ladder to climb toward a transcendent truth they believed was already there. One system is a tool for deconstruction, the other was a vehicle for ascent. This forces us to ask a profound question about our own world of emojis and logos. Have we, in our embrace of the arbitrary sign, gained a clearer understanding of how meaning works, while losing the sense that our symbols can connect us to something real and sacred beyond ourselves? You can still feel the ghost of a medieval cathedral in the soaring atrium of a modern courthouse. Its high, vaulted ceiling is not there by accident. It is a direct descendant of that Neoplatonic urge to pull the human gaze upward, to silently argue for the majesty of law and the aspiration toward a higher justice. This is not a vague historical echo. It is the living legacy of a 1,000-year-old visual language still speaking to us in stone, glass, and steel. Our modern world is saturated with these inherited signs, often without us even realizing it. The corporate logos we see every day are the direct heirs of heraldic coats of arms. A lion emblem for a financial institution does not just suggest strength. It taps into that centuries-old symbolic grammar, declaring stability and noble authority, just as it did for a knight on a medieval battlefield. An eagle for a government agency harks back to that same symbol of transcendent vision, claiming a perspective that rises above the mundane. These are not arbitrary marketing choices. They are the reactivation of a dormant visual vocabulary, a silent shorthand for values we are conditioned to understand almost instinctively. Even the way we process complex information today reveals this deep-seated inheritance. The ubiquitous infographic, with its branching trees and ascending ladders of achievement, is a direct application of the medieval pedagogical diagram. When you look at a flowchart mapping a company's structure or a data visualization showing the growth of a social movement, you are reading a modern Porphyrian tree. Your eye follows the same logical pathways a medieval student would have traced, comprehending hierarchy and relationship through spatial arrangement. The belief that a picture can convey a complex argument more efficiently than a paragraph of text is a profoundly medieval conviction, now reborn in our digital age. This enduring presence proves something vital. The medieval quest for a language without sound was not an historical oddity. It was an early, sophisticated exploration of a fundamental human cognitive tendency. We are wired to think in images and spatial relationships. We naturally convert abstract ideas into mental maps and symbolic forms. The monks with their hand signs, the architects with their upward-thrusting spires, and the scholars with their memory palaces were simply building external tools to suit our internal wiring. Their drive to visualize philosophy taps into the same core impulse that leads a modern scientist to model a black hole or a designer to create an icon on a smartphone screen. We are still seeking that perfect, intuitive sign, that bridge between the invisible world of thought and the visible world of form. This long and rich tradition reminds us that our most modern ways of seeing are, in fact, ancient. Every time we design a symbol to capture a big idea, we are joining a conversation that began in silent monasteries and echoed through stone cathedrals, a conversation about how to make the unseen brilliantly, unmistakably seen. Our journey ends not in silence but with a new way of hearing the past. We have walked through a landscape where hands debated virtue, where cathedrals argued in stone, and where a knight's shield declared his soul's philosophy. This was not a world struggling without words. It was a world thinking in a different key, using the unique power of images and gestures to explore realities that speech alone could not contain. These silent systems were sophisticated, intentional discourses, fully capable of carrying the weight of the cosmos, the nature of the soul, and the path to God. They challenge our modern assumption that language is solely a matter of sounds and sentences, forcing us to admit that some of humanity's most profound thoughts have been articulated without a single spoken word. And this history is not a closed book. Look at the visual grammar of our own digital age. An emoji is more than a cartoon face. It is a compact vessel for emotion and intent, a new kind of gestural shorthand. A viral GIF can convey a complex philosophical stance on society or politics in a few seconds of looping video. The infographics we share and the logos we instantly recognize are our culture's own coats of arms and memory palaces. We are building new silent languages every day, creating systems of meaning that rely on sight and symbol to convey the philosophy of our time. What truths are we encoding in our pixels and animations? What new forms of wisdom or new forms of idolatry are we creating with these tools? The medieval quest to build ladders from the visible to the invisible continues, only now the cathedral is digital. Share your perspective on these modern parallels in the comments, and subscribe to keep exploring the hidden conversations that shape our world.